She laughed at the royal guard, called his horse a statue, and stepped over the barricade just to snap a selfie. But what happened next caught everyone off guard. With one sharp command from the guard and a sudden move from the horse, her smug attitude turned into a muddy, unforgettable public embarrassment. Stick around, because this moment unraveled fast and left the crowd stunned. Before we dive into what really happened, drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Another unbelievable royal guard story is coming your way tomorrow at this same time. On a crisp autumn morning in London, the ancient stones of Buckingham Palace bore witness to an encounter that would echo across the internet for months to come. September 15th began as countless other days had for centuries, with the meticulous preparation for one of Britain's most revered traditions, the changing of the guard ceremony. In the Royal Mews, 28-year-old guardsman Ellis Wells conducted his pre-ceremony inspection with the precision that had been drilled into him through years of military service. His partner in this daily ritual was Thunderbolt, a magnificent coal-black Shire horse standing 17 hands high and weighing nearly a ton. The stallion's imposing frame masked a distinguished military career that few civilians would ever comprehend. Thunderbolt wasn't merely a ceremonial mount, he was a combat veteran whose hooves had pounded across the unforgiving terrain of Helmand Province. Shrapnel scars decorated his powerful shoulders, hidden beneath his gleaming ceremonial coat. His dark eyes held the steady intelligence of a warrior who had carried fallen comrades to safety. While bullets whistled overhead, the gleaming medals adorning his tack weren't decorative trinkets, but genuine military honors earned through acts of courage that would humble most humans. The morning routine between man and horse flowed with practiced efficiency. Wells checked every strap, every buckle, every piece of equipment with the thoroughness of someone who understood that ceremony and duty were inseparable. Thunderbolt stood motionless throughout the process, his breathing steady and his attention focused on the sounds drifting from the palace courtyard where tourists were already gathering. Meanwhile, beyond the palace walls, Karen Mitchell was putting the finishing touches on what she anticipated would be her most spectacular social media content yet. At 39 years old, she had built a modest online following by documenting her privileged lifestyle across Europe's most exclusive destinations. Her followers tuned in to watch her navigate five-star hotels, exclusive boutiques, and cultural landmarks with the casual entitlement that came from never having worked for anything in her life. Today's objective was simple in Karen's mind: capture the perfect content featuring herself with the iconic royal guards. She had researched the timing, studied the positioning, and even practiced her poses in her hotel mirror. What she hadn't researched was the significance of what she was about to witness, or the caliber of the animals and soldiers she was planning to use as props for her personal brand. The palace courtyard gradually filled with visitors from around the world, their voices creating a respectful murmur of anticipation. Families positioned themselves behind the velvet barriers, children pressed against the ropes with wide-eyed wonder, and elderly visitors settled onto portable stools they had brought for the occasion. The atmosphere carried that particular blend of excitement and reverence that surrounded centuries-old traditions. Karen arrived fashionably late, her designer stilettos clicking authoritatively against the cobblestones as she surveyed the assembled crowd. Her outfit had been carefully chosen for maximum visual impact, a pristine white ensemble that would photograph beautifully against the palace's historic backdrop. Her phone was already in her hand, its camera app open and ready to document every moment of her royal encounter. She began her approach through the crowd with the practiced skill of someone accustomed to getting what she wanted regardless of social conventions. Polite "excuse me" requests quickly escalated to more aggressive pushing as she realized the prime viewing spots were already occupied by people who had arrived respectfully early. "Coming through," she announced loudly, her voice cutting through the quiet conversations of those around her. "I'm documenting this for my platform. My followers are waiting." The crowd's reaction was immediate and largely negative. Parents pulled their children closer as Karen elbowed past, and several elderly tourists exchanged disapproving glances at her behavior. But Karen remained focused on her objective, oblivious to the growing wake of irritation she was creating behind her. When the ceremony officially began, the transformation in the courtyard was remarkable. Conversations ceased, cameras were raised respectfully, and even the youngest children seemed to understand they were witnessing something significant. The guards emerged from the palace with military precision, their movements synchronized through years of training and tradition. Wells and Thunderbolt took their assigned position with flawless execution. The massive stallion moved with surprising grace for his size, each step calculated and deliberate. His ears remained constantly mobile, alert to every sound and movement in the crowd. This wasn't performance for Thunderbolt, this was active duty, and his military training meant he approached it with the same seriousness he had brought to combat operations. The crowd's respectful silence was broken only by the measured sounds of the ceremony itself, the synchronized footsteps of the guards, the subtle creaking of leather tack, and the occasional snort from one of the horses. It was a moment of living history, connecting the present day to centuries of British military tradition. Karen, however, found the reverent atmosphere frustrating rather than inspiring. Standing behind the velvet barriers like everyone else simply wasn't acceptable to Karen's vision for her content. The distance between herself and the ceremonial proceedings created what she considered an unacceptable compromise in her production values. Her followers expected intimate access, dramatic angles, and the kind of exclusive footage that would set her apart from other travel influencers. She activated her phone's live streaming function and began providing commentary to her audience, her voice carrying far beyond what the solemn occasion warranted. "Okay, beautiful people, we're live from Buckingham Palace, and honestly, this is pretty boring so far. These guards just stand around like mannequins. I guess that's what passes for entertainment." In England, several people in her immediate vicinity turned to stare at her with expressions ranging from annoyed to horrified. A middle-aged British gentleman cleared his throat meaningfully and gestured toward the ceremony, hoping she would take the hint to lower her voice. Instead, Karen interpreted his attention as validation of her performance. "See that gorgeous horse?" she continued, angling her phone toward Thunderbolt. "He's absolutely massive, but look how still he is. Probably drugged or something to keep him calm for the tourists. These poor animals, standing here like decorations all day." The palace security officer nearest to Karen's position stepped forward with diplomatic professionalism. "Madam, if you could please keep your voice down during the ceremony, it would be greatly appreciated by the other visitors, and oh, please." Karen interrupted with a dismissive laugh. "This isn't a funeral, it's a tourist attraction. Besides, I'm creating promotional content for the palace. They should be thanking me." She had already identified the velvet rope as her primary obstacle to achieving the content she envisioned. The barrier represented everything she despised about rules and restrictions, arbitrary limitations imposed by people who clearly didn't understand her importance or her mission. Without warning or further consideration, Karen ducked smoothly under the rope and strode confidently into the ceremonial space. The collective gasp from the crowd behind her only reinforced her belief that she was creating exactly the kind of dramatic content her followers craved. "Now this is better," she announced to her phone, completely oblivious to the security personnel who were already moving in her direction. "Sometimes you have to take charge and get the shot. People, this is how you create premium content." The moment Karen crossed the barrier, multiple alarm bells began ringing, not literally, but in the trained minds of every security professional and military personnel in the vicinity. What appeared to be harmless tourist enthusiasm was actually a serious breach of protocol that could endanger both the ceremonial proceedings and the safety of everyone involved. Wells felt Thunderbolt's entire body tense beneath him as the stranger approached. The stallion's ears flattened against his skull in a clear warning signal that any experienced horseman would have recognized immediately. His nostrils flared as he processed Karen's scent and demeanor, his combat-trained instincts categorizing her as a potential threat requiring careful monitoring. Karen, however, interpreted the horse's size and stillness as evidence of docility rather than discipline. She positioned herself directly in front of Thunderbolt, raising her phone for what she envisioned as the perfect selfie, herself in the foreground, with the impressive horse and rider creating a dramatic backdrop. "This is perfect, darlings," she narrated to her live stream. "Look at this beautiful creature. He's like a living statue. I bet he's been doing this so long he's practically automated." She reached out with her free hand and grasped Thunderbolt's bridle without permission, attempting to adjust his head position for a better camera angle. The leather felt solid and real in her grip, and for a moment she was pleased with her boldness in taking control of the situation. That was when Wells finally broke his ceremonial silence. "Ma'am, please step away from the horse immediately," he commanded, his voice carrying the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "You are endangering yourself and disrupting an official ceremony." But Karen, was too focused on her performance to process the seriousness of his warning. She had entered that particular zone of social media creation, where external reality became secondary to content production. Her followers were watching, her metrics were climbing, and she was finally getting the exclusive access that would differentiate her from countless other travel bloggers. "Don't worry about me, soldier boy," she replied with casual dismissiveness. "I know what I'm doing. Besides, he seems friendly enough. Look how calm he is." She tightened her grip on Thunderbolt's bridle and reached into her designer purse, with her other hand retrieving what she considered the perfect prop for her next scene, a shiny red apple she had purchased from an upscale London market. The apple Karen produced was nothing like the carefully regulated feed that Thunderbolt received as part of his military-grade nutritional program, coated with commercial wax and treated with chemicals that could potentially harm a horse with specific dietary requirements. It represented exactly the kind of thoughtless gesture that demonstrated Karen's complete ignorance of the situation she had inserted herself into. "Look at this, everyone," she announced to her camera, holding the apple near Thunderbolt's mouth while maintaining her death grip on his bridle. "I'm going to give this gorgeous boy a little treat. He's probably starving, standing here all day." For the tourists, Thunderbolt's reaction was immediate and unmistakable to anyone with military or equine experience. His head jerked backward, his nostrils flared with distress, and every muscle in his powerful frame coiled like a spring ready to release. The unfamiliar scent and the stranger's aggressive handling triggered every alarm in his combat-trained psyche. Wells could feel the stallion's mounting agitation through their shared connection. Years of partnership in dangerous situations had created an almost telepathic bond between man and horse, and right now that bond was transmitting a clear message. Thunderbolt was approaching his breaking point. "Mom, you need to step back right now," Wells ordered with increased urgency. "This is your final warning. That horse is a trained military animal, not a petting zoo attraction." Karen, however, was completely absorbed in her performance. She thrust the apple closer to Thunderbolt's mouth, practically shoving it against his lips while narrating the action for her audience. "Come on, beautiful. Just take a little bite for Mama's followers." The crowd behind the barriers had fallen into stunned silence, sensing that they were about to witness something unprecedented. Children pressed closer to their parents. Elderly visitors gripped their walking sticks more tightly, and even the most casual tourists began reaching for their phones, not to create content, but to document what their instincts told them was about to become a disaster. That was the moment when Thunderbolt's patience finally reached its limit. With the lightning-fast reflexes that had kept him alive through multiple combat deployments, the massive stallion executed what could only be described as a masterpiece of equine justice. Thunderbolt's response was both swift and surgical in its precision. With a powerful shake of his enormous head, he broke free from Karen's grip on his bridle and sent the unwanted apple flying in a perfect arc over the heads of the assembled crowd. The fruit sailed through the London air like a small projectile, eventually landing somewhere near the palace gates, where it would later be discovered by confused pigeons. Karen, who had been pulling against what she assumed was a passive animal, suddenly found herself with nothing to anchor her balance. Her expensive designer heels, perfect for posing but completely inadequate for actual stability, betrayed her on the uneven cobblestones as she stumbled backward with increasing momentum. Time seemed to slow as the crowd watched her backward trajectory with fascination and horror. Her arms windmilled desperately as she fought against gravity and her own poor footwear choices. Her phone spun through the air, its camera still recording as it traced its own independent arc through space. The destination of Karen's uncontrolled retreat was a substantial puddle that had formed in a depression between the ancient cobblestones, fed by London's perpetual drizzle and enriched by the various debris that accumulated in urban environments. The puddle had achieved the perfect consistency for maximum humiliation. Karen's landing was everything the laws of physics and poetic justice could have hoped for. She hit the muddy water with a splash that echoed off the palace walls, completely submerging her pristine white outfit in a mixture of rainwater, dirt, fallen leaves, and the general patina of city life. For several seconds, there was absolute silence in the courtyard. Even the ceremonial proceedings seemed to pause as everyone processed what they had just witnessed. Karen sat in the puddle like a bedraggled statue, water dripping from her hair and makeup running in dark streaks down her cheeks. Then, as if a dam had burst, the crowd erupted in laughter. It started with a single snicker from somewhere in the back, then spread like wildfire through the hundreds of assembled tourists. Within moments, the courtyard was filled with the sound of genuine amusement as people pointed, laughed, and began frantically recording the aftermath on their own devices. Thunderbolt, meanwhile, had returned to his position of perfect military bearing, looking every inch the professional soldier he was. If horses could express satisfaction, he would have been doing so. Instead, he simply maintained his disciplined stance, occasionally flicking his tail in what might have been contentment. Karen's attempts to extract herself from the puddle provided additional entertainment for the crowd. Every time she tried to stand, her impractical footwear would slip on the wet cobblestones, sending her back into the murky water with fresh splashes that delighted the onlookers even more. "This is outrageous," she sputtered, finally managing to achieve a sitting position in the puddle. "That animal attacked me. This is assault. I demand justice. Someone is going to pay for this." Her threats were somewhat undermined by her appearance, which now resembled something that might emerge from a swamp in a horror movie. Her carefully styled hair was plastered to her skull. Her designer outfit had turned various shades of brown and green, and bits of debris clung to her like organic accessories. Several kind-hearted tourists moved forward to offer assistance, but Karen waved them away with wounded dignity. "Don't touch me. This is all negligence. Where were the warnings? Where was the security? That horse is clearly dangerous and should be destroyed." Her phone, meanwhile, had completed its own journey and now floated peacefully in a separate puddle several feet away. The device was still live streaming, providing Karen's followers with an excellent underwater view of London's street drainage system, while occasionally broadcasting glimpses of her continued struggles. The palace security team that had been converging on the scene finally reached Karen's position. The senior officer, a man whose patience had been tested by decades of dealing with difficult visitors, extended a professional but weary hand to help her stand. "Madam, if you'll permit us to assist you, we can escort you to facilities where you can clean yourself up." "And I don't want to clean myself up," Karen shrieked, finally achieving a wobbly standing position. "I want that beast put down. I want that guard arrested. I want everyone responsible for this disaster fired immediately." Her tirade was interrupted by the arrival of a new voice, one that carried the unmistakable weight of absolute military authority. "Excuse me, madam, but I believe you may be confused about what transpired here." The voice belonged to Colonel Patricia Thornfield, the senior officer responsible for all ceremonial activities involving the household cavalry. Standing nearly 6 feet tall in her immaculate uniform, Thornfield presented an imposing figure whose ribbons and medals told the story of a distinguished career spanning 3 decades of military service. Her steel blue eyes had witnessed everything from diplomatic ceremonies to active combat, and they were currently focused on Karen with the intensity of a predator evaluating prey. Colonel Thornfield had observed the entire incident from her command position and had reached her own conclusions about what had occurred. Her assessment was both swift and final, based on years of experience managing both difficult situations and entitled individuals who confused their desires with their rights. Karen spun around to face her, water still streaming from her bedraggled appearance. "Finally, someone with authority. I demand satisfaction. That horse deliberately attacked me. I was simply trying to create content, and that monster assaulted me." Thornfield listened to the complaint with the same expression she might wear while reviewing a weather report, professionally attentive but completely unmoved by the emotional content. When Karen finally paused for breath, the colonel responded with the measured precision of someone whose words carried the force of law. "Madam, allow me to correct several misconceptions you appear to harbor. First, you deliberately ignored multiple warnings from my personnel and violated clearly established security protocols. Second, you physically interfered with an active military ceremony involving both personnel and equipment. You had no authorization to approach." Karen opened her mouth to protest, but Thornfield's raised hand silenced her as effectively as a command to cease fire. "Third, you attempted to feed an unknown substance to a military animal without permission, training, or knowledge of his dietary requirements. Fourth, you disrupted a ceremonial proceeding that represents centuries of British military tradition. Fifth, you have demonstrated complete disrespect for the institution you are visiting and the professionals who dedicate their lives to serving it." The crowd, which had been murmuring appreciatively, fell silent as Thornfield continued her systematic dismantling of Karen's position. "Now, regarding your claim that Thunderbolt attacked you, allow me to educate you about the animal you so carelessly manhandled and so casually dismissed as a beast." Thornfield's voice carried across the courtyard, with the clarity of someone accustomed to addressing large groups under challenging conditions. Every word was being recorded by dozens of phones, and her military bearing commanded attention even from those who had initially come simply to watch the ceremony. Thunderbolt is a decorated veteran for combat deployments in Afghanistan and Iraq, she continued, her tone carrying the weight of absolute authority. He has carried wounded soldiers across hostile terrain while under enemy fire. He has maintained his position during mortar attacks that would send civilians fleeing in terror. He has participated in operations that saved countless human lives. The crowd's murmur shifted to one of genuine respect and interest. Several military veterans in the audience began nodding approvingly, recognizing the honor being paid to a fellow service member regardless of species. The decorations on his ceremonial equipment are not mere ornaments, Thornfield explained, gesturing toward Thunderbolt's impressive regalia. They represent genuine military honors earned through acts of courage and service. This horse has more combat experience and battlefield decorations than most human soldiers will accumulate in entire careers. Karen, now shivering in her wet clothes and increasingly aware of the hostile mood of the crowd, attempted to interrupt. I don't care about his military service. He attacked an innocent tourist. I have rights as a visitor to this country. Indeed, you do. Thornfield agreed with the kind of icy politeness that made her words more cutting than outright hostility. You have the right to observe our ceremonies from the designated areas established for your safety. You have the right to conduct yourself with the basic civility expected of any civilized person. You have the right to treat our personnel, both human and animal, with the respect they have earned through their service. She paused, allowing that concept to settle before delivering her next point. What you emphatically do not have is the right to endanger yourself, our animals, or our ceremonies for the sake of your social media ambitions. What you do not have is the right to treat a combat veteran as a prop for your personal entertainment. Karen's face had turned red beneath the mud and running makeup, though whether from embarrassment, anger, or cold was difficult to determine. You can't speak to me like this. I'm an American citizen with constitutional rights. I have influence. I'll have you all reported. Thornfield's expression remained unchanged, but there was something in her bearing that suggested she had faced far more formidable opponents than an entitled tourist having a public meltdown. Madam, Thornfield replied with the patience of someone who had dealt with genuinely dangerous enemies. I have served Her Majesty's forces for 30 years. I have commanded operations in active war zones where real threats exist daily. Your social media influence concerns me approximately as much as your respect for others, which is to say, not at all. The crowd was now openly applauding Thornfield's measured demolition of Karen's position. Phones continued recording every moment, and Karen's humiliation was being broadcast to the world in real time across multiple platforms. Simultaneously, her own device continued its lonely vigil in the nearby puddle, occasionally transmitting glimpses of cobblestones and debris to her increasingly entertained followers. Furthermore, the colonel continued, if you review the extensive video evidence that numerous witnesses have undoubtedly captured, you will observe that Thunderbolt exhibited nothing more than natural defensive behavior when confronted with unwanted physical contact and inappropriate feeding attempts. As if choreographed, several tourists began displaying their phone screens, the footage clearly showing Karen's aggressive approach and Thunderbolt's relatively restrained response. The evidence was overwhelmingly clear. Karen had engineered her own downfall through entitled behavior and complete disregard for basic safety protocols. I'm injured, Karen protested, though her injuries appeared to consist entirely of wounded pride and thoroughly soaked clothing. I could have been seriously hurt. That animal is clearly dangerous and should be removed from public contact. The only danger present today, madam, was your own behavior. Thornfield responded with unwavering calm. Had you remained in the designated areas, had you shown even minimal respect for the ceremony and its participants, none of this unfortunate incident would have occurred. She gestured toward Thunderbolt, who remained in perfect formation despite the continued chaos surrounding him. Observe him now, completely motionless, perfectly disciplined, entirely professional. This is an animal who has maintained his position while buildings exploded around him. Your theatrical display does not even register as a minor disturbance. As palace security finally escorted the thoroughly defeated Karen toward a side entrance, where she could attempt to restore some semblance of dignity, the crowd began to disperse with animated conversations about what they had witnessed. Many were already uploading their footage to social media platforms, where the story was rapidly gaining traction as the most viral video of the year. Karen's departure was far from graceful. Her ruined heels made walking treacherous on the wet cobblestones, and her saturated clothing clung uncomfortably to her frame. Every few steps, she would turn back to launch additional threats at Thornfield, Thunderbolt, or anyone else within range. But her words carried no weight given her thoroughly bedraggled state. "This isn't finished," she called over her shoulder as security guided her away. "You'll be hearing from my lawyers. Everyone will know how I was treated here." Behind her, Thunderbolt finally received his well-deserved reward, a proper horse treat from the palace's head groom, the kind of nutrition that was actually appropriate for a military animal of his caliber. The great stallion accepted his prize with the dignity befitting a decorated veteran, his performance throughout the ordeal having been absolutely flawless. Within hours, Karen's humiliation would be complete and global. Her threatened lawsuit would be dismissed by every legal professional she approached. Her social media following would actually decrease as people unfollowed her in droves, and her story would become a cautionary tale about the consequences of entitled behavior. But perhaps most importantly, millions of people around the world would learn about Thunderbolt's genuine service record, his real heroism, and the respect owed to all those who serve their countries, whether they walk on two legs or four.